I live in Africa, surrounded by its rich landscapes and diverse wildlife. My love for adventure and the wild led me to one of the continent's most enchanting and mysterious places, Kakamega Forest in Kenya. This ancient rainforest, often referred to as the last of the great forests in Kenya, has always intrigued me with its dense foliage and whispered legends. Its name alone evokes images of untamed beauty and hidden secrets, promising an experience like no other. I set off early one morning. My backpack was heavy with gear: a tent, sleeping bag, provisions, and my trusty camera, ready to capture the beauty of the forest. As I entered the woods, the air was thick with the scent of earth and greenery. The canopy above was dense, casting a perpetual twilight over the forest floor. Every step was accompanied by the crunch of leaves and the distant calls of exotic birds. The deeper I ventured, the more the forest revealed its secrets. Gigantic trees with ancient bark reached skyward, their roots snaking across the ground like serpents. The sunlight filtering through the foliage created shifting patterns of light and shadow, making the forest seem alive and constantly changing. I marveled at the diversity of flora. Vibrant orchids clung to the trunks, while ferns unfurled like green lace on the forest floor. Hours passed, and by late afternoon, I found a small clearing beside a winding stream, a perfect spot for setting up camp. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the landscape. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made a small fire. As I watched the flames dance, I felt a sense of peace and accomplishment. Nightfall transformed the forest. The comforting noises of the day gave way to an eerie silence. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant chirps of night insects. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, convincing myself it was just the forest settling into its nocturnal rhythm. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was as if the wind carried faint voices, just beyond the edge of hearing. I told myself it was merely the forest playing tricks on me, but the whispers grew more distinct, calling my name in a disembodied, haunting tone. My skin prickled with a cold sweat as I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. As I ventured away from the camp, the darkness of the woods seemed to close in around me. The beam of my flashlight cut through the night, revealing twisted trees and thick underbrush. The whispers grew louder, their cadence rhythmic and unsettling. It felt as though the forest itself was alive and conspiring against me. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the underbrush, I saw her, a figure standing among the trees. At first glance, she appeared to be an ordinary woman, but as I drew closer, I realized she was far from normal. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed with an eerie light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Her long, tattered dress fluttered as though caught in an unseen wind. The sight of her sent a jolt of fear through me. Her face, though unmistakably feminine, was contorted in a way that defied natural beauty. Her expression was a mixture of sorrow and malevolence, and I could feel an overwhelming sense of dread emanating from her. It was as if the very air around her was charged with dark energy. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I needed no further encouragement. I turned on my heel and fled through the forest, my flashlight beam flickering wildly. The whispers behind me grew louder, merging into a discordant symphony of eerie voices. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness seemed to press in on me, and I could barely see where I was going. I finally burst into the clearing where my camp was set up, gasping for breath. The firelight seemed to cast long, sinister shadows on the trees around me. I quickly grabbed my gear. The whispers continued, now fading into the distance but still sending shivers down my spine. With a final, terrified glance at the forest, I fled towards the edge of the woods. The night air was cold and damp, and I could hear the distant roar of nocturnal creatures, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself to the limit, driven by fear and the need to escape. My mind raced with images of the ghostly figure and the disembodied whispers. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I didn't pause. I continued on to the nearest town, my body aching and my spirit shaken. The warmth and light of the town felt like a sanctuary. To this day, I can't explain the events of that night. The experience in Yucca Woods left me with a profound sense of unease and a newfound respect for the forest's mysteries. Some places, I've learned, hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. As I recount the tale, I find solace in knowing that I escaped with my life. But the whispers of the African woods continue to haunt my dreams. I've always been a night owl. There's something about the world after dark that calls to me. The stillness, the quiet, the way the mundane transforms into something almost magical. That's why, when the urge to go for a drive struck me at 2 a.m., I didn't think twice, and headed out into the cool, moonlit night. Willow Road was my usual route, a winding stretch of asphalt that cut through dense woods on the outskirts of town. It was a road I knew well, every twist and turn memorized from countless drives. But that night, as I eased onto the road, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, or the way the moonlight barely pierced the canopy above. Whatever it was, it made me uneasy. I turned on the radio, hoping some music would drown out the creeping sense of dread. Static. I flipped through the stations, but all I got was more static. I turned it off with a sigh, resigning myself to the silence, which now seemed oppressive rather than peaceful. I was about 5 miles in when I saw the figure. It was just standing there in the middle of the road, about 50 yards ahead, illuminated by my headlights. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. This was a lonely stretch of road, and the idea of someone being out here at this hour was strange, to say the least. I honked the horn, a quick tap, hoping to get his attention. No reaction. He didn't move, didn't even seem to notice I was there. I hesitated, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. Something about this didn't feel right. Common sense told me to turn around and go home, but curiosity won out. I eased the car forward, moving closer to the figure. As I drew nearer, the details became clearer. The man or whatever it was stood impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed unnaturally elongated, giving him a twisted, otherworldly appearance. His clothes were tattered and torn, hanging off him like rags, flapping in the faint breeze, as if they had been left to rot for decades. But what truly chilled me to the bone were his eyes, two glowing orbs that burned with an eerie, unnatural light. They pierced through the darkness, locking onto me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I wanted to reverse, to get out of there as fast as I could, but I was frozen, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, without warning, the figure began to move. Slowly, almost lazily, it turned its head towards me. I felt my breath catch in my throat as that blank, featureless face locked onto me. It was as if it was staring right through me, seeing something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. Panic set in. I could barely keep the car on the road as I reversed at breakneck speed. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to see how much further I had before I could turn around, but the road behind me seemed to stretch on forever. A tunnel of darkness with no end in sight. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Just like that, it had vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was as if it had never existed. I didn't stop to question it. I spun the car around, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped back the way I'd come. I didn't slow down until I reached the edge of town, my hands trembling on the wheel. The streetlights, the familiar buildings, they all looked so comforting, so normal, but I knew I'd never look at them the same way again. I don't drive on Willow Road anymore. I can't. Every time I think about it, I see that figure, that smooth, blank face staring back at me. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the static on the radio, even when it's turned off, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for another traveler to come down that lonely stretch of road. When we moved into our new house, my parents made one rule crystal clear: never open the door to the old room at the end of the hallway. That room is off limits, he said firmly. Do not go in there, ever. The house itself was old, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows that made the curtains sway even when there was no breeze. It was the kind of place that seemed to have a life of its own, and the forbidden room only added to its unsettling character. At first, I didn't think much about the room. It was just a door at the end of a long, dim hallway, always closed and locked. My parents kept the key hidden away, and they never spoke about it. But as the weeks passed, the hallway seemed to change, especially at night. It started with the whispers. Faint at first, barely audible, like the distant murmur of someone talking far away. I'd be in my room, reading or trying to fall asleep, when I'd hear them soft, almost imperceptible, but there. The first few times, I convinced myself it was just the house settling, the wind slipping through the cracks. But the more I listened, the more I realized these weren't just random noises. They were voices, whispering in hushed, urgent tones. I tried to ignore them, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They would start as soon as the house was quiet, late at night when everyone else was asleep. I'd lie in bed, the blankets pulled up to my chin, straining to make out the words. It sounded like multiple voices, all speaking at once, their tones sharp and hurried, like they were arguing or pleading. Sometimes the whispers seemed to come from right outside my bedroom door, in the hallway. Other times they were muffled, as if they were trapped behind a wall. But no matter where they came from, they always seemed to be leading me toward that room, toward the door I wasn't supposed to open. One night, the whispers were louder than ever, almost frantic. They seemed to fill the entire hallway, echoing off the walls, overlapping in a cacophony of disembodied voices. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart pounded in my chest as I got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the thin curtains. I stepped into the hallway, and the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just random sounds, they were words, but in a language I couldn't understand. The voices were agitated, as if urging me forward. I found myself standing in front of the forbidden door before I even realized it. The air around the door was colder, and the wood looked older than the rest of the house, as if it had been there for centuries. My breath hitched as I slowly turned the knob, the old metal creaking in the stillness. The door opened with a low, mournful groan. The room beyond was dark, colder than the rest of the house, and smelled of damp and decay. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was coated with dust, as if no one had entered in years. But then, in the far corner of the room, I saw her. A woman, or what had once been a woman. Her long hair hung in tangled, matted strands, and her dress was old-fashioned, tattered, and stained. I wanted to run, to get out of that room as fast as I could, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Slowly, she began to turn. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over her skull. But it was her eyes that terrified me the most, dark, hollow, and void of any emotion. They seemed to look right through me, as if I wasn't really there. The whispers started again, louder now, angry and accusatory. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised her hand, pointing directly at me. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I finally managed to break free from the paralysis and stumbled backward, my body trembling with fear. The woman's expression twisted into something horrible, a grotesque smile that didn't reach her empty eyes. That was enough to snap me out of my terror. I turned and fled, nearly tripping over my own feet in my desperation to get out of the room. The door slammed behind me as I burst into the hallway, the force of it rattling the walls. My hands shook as I fumbled with the key, barely managing to lock the door before collapsing against it. I stumbled back to my room, my body numb and my mind racing. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers over my head, and waited for morning to come. When my parents returned the next day, I didn't tell them what had happened. I couldn't. They would never believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? The room was locked, the key hidden away, and I promised myself I would never go near it again.